Five of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome back to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films from this chosen year, and in this video we'll be talking about the year 2019, so let's get started. Before we get into your top 5, here are the many honourable mentions for this year. Jojo Rabbit, Good Boys, Zombieland Double Tap, The Peanut Butter Falcon, Rocket Man, Marriage Story, Toy Story 4, Spider-Man Far From Home, It Chapter 2, Honey Boy, The Irishman, Dark Waters, Official Secrets, Uncut Gems, Parasite, Us, El Camino, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. John Wick Chapter 3 Parabellum is directed by Chad Stahelski and stars Keanu Reeves, Halle Berry and Ian McShane. So, by 2019, this was the 3rd John Wick movie and it's the 3rd appearance for John Wick in 5 of the Best. Now, I have to say, and I say this every time I talk about John Wick, and if you've been on the channel for a while, you're probably sick of me saying this, so I apologise for the repeating nature of this, but I just can't emphasise it enough because it is so rare. John Wick is the only series that it just impresses me so much by how much it increases in quality by every entry. The weakest, in my opinion, is the first, and you tell me any other longer running film series that starts with the worst film. And again, I'm saying the worst film in quotation marks because the first John Wick is great, but they just get better and better. The second one builds so much on the first one, brings it into more of a larger scale. But John Wick Chapter 3 takes that again and builds on it tenfold. John Wick Chapter 3 is, for everything that was brilliant about the first 2 films, again, they're just built on every tiny detail. Things you wouldn't have thought you needed in a John Wick. And this is the thing that also carries through to the Chapter 4, and we'll get there when we get there. But when we're talking about John Wick Chapter 3, I thought, and I have to say, I did come into John Wick Chapter 3 with a little bit of skepticism, because I thought the first one was good, the second one was even better, and I thought, well, that was the flash in the pan, and that was about it. I thought the third one would have been, okay, well, the trope of these action scenes are just getting a bit lackluster, and you were getting a bit sick of them. Absolutely not the case. It's actually one of the most revolutionary action movies of the recent genre, and the recent times in the genre, I should say, because there is so much that John Wick as a series has done for action movies. And certainly it has its place, because if you think, okay, if I said to you, what are the great action movies since 2005? You might say things like Taken. You might say things like The Equalizer. And while there is good parts of those, the first Taken is great, I've talked about it before in this series. The Equalizer is also great, the first one. But what they do, and especially in both of their cases, it's the first entry is far and away the best of what they bring. Denzel Washington and Liam Neeson, respectively, are brilliant in the first film because it's the best story and it's the most well-refined. Whereas John Wick is actually the flip of that. It takes a basis and a little... And I will be honest, whenever I had seen... Because obviously Taken was a good bit before John Wick. And when I seen John Wick, the first one being advertised, I thought, okay, so Keanu Reeves is getting his Liam Neeson taken version of an action series. But then there's a lot more lore based on comic books, based on just... It clearly wasn't just another cash grab, or it wasn't just a different variation of the same action, spy, killer story, action hero. John Wick is something completely different. And I think by this point, even by Parabellum and by the third entry, and not to mention Chapter 4, because if you've seen that, I have my initial thoughts video on that, and when it gets to 5 of the best, I'm sure it'll appear for that year. John Wick, by Chapter 3, already was, I think, my favourite action series, certainly since the year 2000. The only things that I could, of the previous era, or time past, that would rival it, is probably Die Hard. The first 3 Die Hard films. But again, by the 4th and 5th of Die Hard, it really fell off a cliff. Not that, well, the 4th one's okay, but the 5th one is really, really bad. And I know a lot of people don't think the second Die Hard is that great, but certainly the first is one of the most iconic films of that era, and certainly action films ever. And then the third one with Samuel L. Jackson brings so much to it. So that's one that I always think, and now, in my mind, at this point, and the point of me recording this, John Wick and Die Hard are my 2 favourite action series. So there's how much praise that I give to John Wick. And that was definite in my mind by the end of Parabellum. Not even the 4th film. I love this. I think Keanu Reeves gets better in the role. The role gets more defined. And again, I talk about the world building and the kind of overarching story about the table and the higher powers and hierarchy of this kind of spy world. This contract killer assassin world is probably a better description than spy. And then you bring in the addition of someone like Halle Berry, who of course had been a Bond girl a lot of years ago in Die Another Day, but for her to come in this and to be one of the greatest parts of the film, you add the element of dogs into this, which as a dog lover, as I'm sure a lot of you are as well, this was such a such a brilliant addition to the film. And this whole the whole sequence with Halle Berry in this is one of the more memorable action scenes for me in recent memory, for sure. You have Ian McShane, who continues to be fantastic as Vincent, and their dynamic, him and Keanu Reeves as John Wick, their dynamic throughout the film. And one of my favourite parts of this is how quickly, you know, when you get these longer running and overarching storylines that have maybe multiple films, and there's a big gap between certain installments, the second film ends, and the third film begins within probably 5 minutes of each other, storyline-wise. So that there is a continuing through line there, which brings such a connection to it. And if you're watching it on a binge, if you're watching John Wick 1 to John Wick 4, and I'm sure as the story continues, if you're watching it all at once, or if you're binging them all, it is more of a worthy time, and there's a clearer story than just, well, these are different outings and he killed a lot of people here and there was this and this. It's not. It's a very coherent story, and that's something I appreciate a lot, because sometimes action films can be described as mindless, and I think John Wick is everything but. There's a clear focus on the craft of stunt performing, and that comes from the director, of course, with Chad Stahelski, who of course is a stuntman, stunt professional turned into director. So clearly there's a honing of the craft of gunfighting, sword fighting, dog fighting, any kind of fighting, and to have all that and for it to be built on each film. John Wick 3 is a brilliant action film. It really surprised me again, and it was really where it got in my mind that this series is getting better film by film. The first is great, the second one is even better, the third one is even better than the second, and just a bit of a spoiler for times coming, John Wick Chapter 4 is even better than Chapter 3. So there is so much to love in the John Wick franchise. I really, as you've heard me say there, I think it's one of my favourite. It's definitely one of my top 2, even top 3 if I'm being generous, top 3 action film franchises of all time. It is just brilliant. And for Keanu Reeves, who I enjoyed in The Matrix and enjoyed in things like The Devil's Advocate and a lot of movies, kind of late 90s, Speed, a few others, I didn't think, and I think I've said this before when I talked about John Wick, I might have said this in my Chapter 2 part, or the initial thoughts in Chapter 4, I didn't think that Keanu Reeves had this kind of performance in him. This stoic, kind of chiseled in stone killer that is like something of mythos in the storyline. And for him to bring that, and John Wick is one of the most memorable characters in recent memory, I would say. One of the more recognisable characters. John Wick as a series is brilliant, and John Wick Chapter 3 is just one of the many reasons it is, because it has some of the best examples of why the series is so good, why it's such a staple of action, the action movie genre at the moment, and it really is the benchmark for so many action movies now. So yeah, that's why I would definitely recommend John Wick Chapter 3. Number 4. Avengers Endgame is directed by the Russo brothers and stars Robert Downey Jr., Chris Evans, and a hell of a lot of other people. So, in complete transparency and honesty, I didn't know where to put Avengers Endgame on my top 5 for this year. Because Avengers Endgame isn't really a movie. Avengers Endgame was an event. It was a follow-up to a brilliant movie in Infinity War, which I talked about when it was released, and Endgame felt like an event that everybody who was in this kind of fandom, even people that were kind of on the outskirts of fandom of Marvel, they still had to see the culmination of the story. The 21, 22, whatever it was, movie story by that point, the Infinity Saga, as it was known, the culmination and the end of that story. And what an ending it is. And the reason I say that is because when I talk about Endgame and how it has such a worthy payoff. It's brilliantly rewarding for being a fan. And I think why this was so effective is because at this time in 2019, and you'll remember it yourselves, there was 3 big endings, if you like, of 3 major IPs. We had the end of the Infinity Saga with Avengers Endgame, which we'll talk about and how brilliant it is here. But we also had 2 other things, 2 other staples of media that finished that year. We had, or around that time, or maybe kind of end of 2018 into 2019. Around this time, we had the end of Game of Thrones, which, if you were a fan of Game of Thrones, it was brilliant it was some of the most pinnacle of television, up to about season 5, season 6. And then they got past the books and went into season 7, and yeah, we know how it ended. I'm sure even if you're not a fan or didn't even watch it, you know the backlash and the feeling of the ending of Game of Thrones. So I'm not going to delve into too much of that, but it wasn't a reward for the fans for sticking with it. And the other one was Rise of Skywalker, which, when I talked about Force Awakens and how it started a trilogy so well, for it to end so much like a wet fart, that really was, and for it to have such a long-lasting legacy for Star Wars, to have started in 1977 with The New Hope, and for that to be the 9th film and that be the end of Star Wars in quotation marks. I'm sure they'll build on it. I'm sure they'll make another trilogy, because of course they will. But they were things, and the reason I bring them up, because of course they're not really related to Endgame, but the reason I want to touch on them is because they were things that people have been die-hard fans of, and people that have absolutely adored these IPs and these stories and these characters for so long. A lot longer than the MCU's been about. Remember, the first Iron Man only started in 2008, and yes, Game of Thrones was a bit later than that, of course, but something like Star Wars has been on the minds for so many generations now. And to look at Endgame, and you were coming in, and maybe I was the only one who felt like this, or was there maybe a few people that felt like this, where they usually don't stick the landing. Usually, things like this that are hyped up so much, they're a bit of a disappointment. I think Avengers Endgame is one of the best finales of anything. And I say that because of the pressure on it to have such a brilliant film like Infinity War. And let's not get that twisted. Infinity War is a better film than Avengers Endgame is. But them as a 2-parter is one of the greatest 2 parts. But then you may say, and that's a fair argument to say, well, it's 21 films, it's not 2 parts. And that's true. If you want to get the whole story, it is a lot more than just the 2 films. But as a 2-parter, as a cliffhanger that ended in 2018, and for the finality to come a year later, it was such a worthy experience. A very emotional experience. You realised by this, and certainly it kind of began, you really began to notice in Infinity War how much you care for these characters, but by Avengers Endgame you really have developed such a bond and such a care for so many of these characters, and not many more than Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man. Of course, that's where the franchise began. 2008, everything relies on him, if you like. And the reason the MCU began and was such a success, he had to knock it out of the park with his performance as Tony Stark, and that rhymed. But he is... I mean, his performance in Avengers Endgame is fantastic. Very emotional, very powerful. A lot more than you would think for just a, and I put this in very much quotation marks, superhero film. Because if you think about what superhero films used to be, superhero films in kind of the late 90s, the early 2000s, things like X-Men, things like Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, which, of course, they have their love, and I don't hate those films. I really enjoy a lot of the elements that they have in those films, but they never took themselves too seriously. It was clearly a bit of a tongue-in-cheek depiction of these characters, whereas the Russo brothers in particular, but a lot of the directors, people like James Gunn as well in the MCU with the Guardians of the Galaxy, really cares about character development. And of course that doesn't stretch to every single Marvel character, it certainly does not. But certainly in these big culmination films, things like Endgame, things like Infinity War, things like Ragnarok that has a lot of characters, and even Taika Waititi brings a lot in it to the characters he's given. Things like Civil War. All these kind of culmination films, it isn't just, let's get all these characters together and fight an enemy or whatever. There is a clear care about each character's story being told. And that is so rewarding as a fan. And that's the thing that I couldn't get away from when I thought about when I was coming to talk about Avengers Endgame and the ending of this story. And of course the MCU continues. And truthfully it hasn't reached the heights of this since. There's been a few shining lights, but there hasn't been too much that have came close to scraping what emotion they were able to get from Infinity War and Endgame as a 2-film spectacle. Other performances like Chris Evans as well, Scarlett Johansson. I mean, there's so many. I'm not even going to go through names because there's so many in this film, and there isn't too many characters that we care about that feels like they get shortchanged in this. I know there's a little bit of an argument for Star-Lord for Infinity War and Endgame, but I don't even think that was too bad. I think a lot of people blown that out of proportion just because of his role in the story. I think the Endgame is just... The longer the time goes on, it'll be more and more astounding in how much they pulled off a worthy ending to this. Because it's one thing to have an ending to a trilogy, which is, obviously just the 3 films. The first one can be good, they capitalise, make a sequel, leads into the third one, and then it's good, and that's a good trilogy. But to have 21 films, and to garner fans as the movies go and go and go, and this is the 4th Avengers film, so the 4th culmination film of all the characters, and to have that be so... I don't think there was too many people that felt shortchanged by Endgame, and that is a real testament. Again, I go back to what I was saying about things like Star Wars and Game of Thrones, where the fans felt let down. Fans felt that, and not everybody, of course, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but when you speak and you talk about these Game of Thrones and Star Wars and that, the sequel trilogy, a lot of people were let down. And a larger majority, I would imagine, felt let down or felt shortchanged. And that's not the case for Avengers Endgame. Actually, quite the opposite. A worthy ending to so many characters' story. And I kind of would have been happy if there was a bit of a break after this. Because before Endgame even finished, we had Spider-Man Far From Home, and I enjoy that film. But I just think you could have gave us a break. It's been 20-something films. give us a 6 month to a year to even 18 months break from the MCU, and then garner the hype to go again, to start again and build to something further, continue some of the stories and build to the next Avengers Endgame, if you like. Whereas what we've had since has been a bit of an incoherent mess. So but to see the contrast of the bad and to juxtapose that with the good, Avengers Endgame is a brilliant finale. One of the best finales in recent memory of any kind of IP, and it was worthy. And that's what was the biggest surprise of all. An actual great film and a great ending to this all. Number 3. Knives Out is directed by Rian Johnson and stars Daniel Craig, Ana de Armas and Chris Evans. And look at that, Chris Evans making back-to-back appearances. Go on, Chris. Yeah, Knives Out, talking about the sequel trilogy there, talking about Rian Johnson, of course, with The Last Jedi, which was probably the most polarizing film in the last decade, maybe even 2 decades, in the sense of how the fandom felt about it. So for him, and that kind of worried me, because I thought that while I didn't love The Last Jedi, but I also didn't hate it as much as so many people did, I was just kind of, it was fine. That was my feeling on The Last Jedi. But talking about Rian Johnson, whenever there was a murder mystery movie coming out, which I'm not a massive fan of, I have to say. I'm not really a fan of the genre. Different things like these, different murder mysteries, Murder in the Orient Express, or kind of the Hercule Poirot movies, or any of that kind of genre, was never something that I found myself latching any kind of fondness to. Not that I hated them, but it just never really spoke to me until Knives Out. And for Rian Johnson to have both written and directed both this and Glass Onion, which we'll talk about when we get there. But let's talk about the first film. Knives Out, Daniel Craig doing a Foghorn Leghorn voice, that's not for me. That's not my cup of tea, is what I thought. But you have such a talented cast. And anytime I see a talented cast now, I always... And this is how much I love Knives Out. Because Knives Out as a series now. Knives Out, then Glass Onion, and then whatever the next film will be. The reason I love Knives Out is because whenever I see a big ensemble cast that I feel that is wasted potential. You know, you get these films from some of these more indie directors and they have like 10 Academy Award winners and they do absolutely nothing with it. They waste that opportunity. Every time I see a film like that, I think the same thing. Imagine that had been a Knives Out film with all those actors. And this movie is of course the reason why. Because you have so many characters here, people like Jamie Lee Curtis, Toni Collette, the list goes on. I'm not just going to name the whole cast, but you have such high level actors and actresses in both of these movies, but the first one really gets the ball rolling. And the reason it is so good, the reason as a murder mystery it is so good, is because it subverts your expectations. And that's such a cliche phrase that you hear when people talk about movies. But Knives Out is one of the better examples in recent times, because it takes the murder mystery trope, flips it on its head, and makes it so much more engaging than just, somebody's died, let's find out what happened, oh it was you. Essentially a Scooby-Doo episode. No, we don't want that. We want something that really flips it on its head. And Knives Out does that. And the performances... But let's talk about the main man doing his Foghorn Leghorn voice in Daniel Craig. Now, truthfully, both my mum and my dad have went, I don't really like Knives Out. And I went, why do you not like it? Why do you not like the movie? Oh, well, I didn't like Daniel Craig doing that stupid voice. And I went, well, just watch the film and forget about his voice. Because it's so good. It's so good. And the voice is great. I think it's such... A Daniel Craig, of course, at this time, still No Time to Die hadn't even come out yet. So his Bond legacy hadn't even finished. So he still was typecast as Bond. That, again, and a bit like what I talked about with John Wick there, that action hero, that spy, kind of stoic-natured guy. So for him to play this character, Benoit Blanc, as one of the more memorable characters in recent times, and one of the most likeable. I think so. And I know, again, I've just told you 2 examples of people that do not like the voice and put it off the movie as a whole. I just don't get that. And I find that really shallow of them to not watch this film. I think it's so good. So good. Someone like Ana de Armas, who of course is the love of my life, but forget about that. For her in this performance, she also is so good. And the dynamic between the 2 of them, again, way before their escapades in No Time to Die, and both in very different roles. And it really shows their depth as actors. There's so much to love here, and there isn't a part of Knives Out. And you've heard me say this on a few movies, but this is one of the better examples that I can think of, where I don't think there's a moment of Knives Out when I am not trying to figure this out. Certainly on the first watch. Even on a rewatch, there's more things you learn, so it isn't like, once you know the story, let's not watch it again. You know, it was good and that's it. Knives Out has so much rewatchability, but also on the first watch of these, and I apply that to both first film and Glass Onion, there is so much to take in, there's so much to learn. If you're really paying attention, it's a worthy film experience. It's you paying attention as an audience member is key, because if you're checked out at any point, but that also shows how good Rian Johnson and the people behind this movie have honed the craft, because if you weren't invested, you would not care. You have to be checked in to a Knives Out film at all points, and the best part is you will be, because it's so good. Knives Out is one of my favourite murder mysteries ever. The only movie that is a murder mystery that contends with Knives Out is Glass Onion, which of course is a sequel and is also a Knives Out movie. I love both of these so much, but the first one does stick in my mind for, you know, when you get those movies that really change your opinion on a genre, or really change your opinion on just a certain type of film. You know, where you maybe you don't like horror films, and then you see a certain film and you go, well, do you know what? I'm kind of interested in horror movies as a whole now. That's like me for murder mysteries. So now, because of the Knives Out and how brilliant they are, I go and see things like Death on the Nile, the Hercule Poirot, Kenneth Branagh film, which is obviously a sequel to Murder in the Orient Express. And then there's Haunting in Venice, of course. So they are obviously rivaling, and while I do quite like the Hercule Poirot ones, they really don't hold a candle to the Benoit Blanc films, the Knives Out films. But it's got me really invested in this genre. So that's the testament I can give to Knives Out. Before this movie, before I sat and watched Knives Out, I could not care less about murder mystery films, because again, I had it in my head that we're all, like I said earlier, oh, someone's dead, let's find out who it is. Oh, well, it was that fella. Okay, bye. Scooby-Doo, basically. That's it. All it takes is one movie to really subvert an expectation, and then you're in for them all. And that's how I am with Knives Out, and that's why I love it so much. Number 2. Dr. Sleep is directed by Mike Flanagan and stars Ewan McGregor and Rebecca Ferguson. Now, Dr. Sleep, where do I start when talking about this? Where do I start with talking about the sequel to The Shining that is almost or about 50 years in the making? Well, I'm going to do my best to try and justify talking about Dr. Sleep. And you know what the thing, and I will start by saying this, the thing that I think is so criminal is that this film kind of went under the radar a little bit because of other films, and you've seen how many honourable mentions there was this year. There was a lot of movies to love and digest, and certainly I did. You can tell by the amount of honourable mentions and the ones I've talked about so far. But what I will say is Dr. Sleep is one of my favourite sequels ever. Dr. Sleep is one of my favourite horror films ever. Again, like The Shining. The Shining, of course, is so many people's favourite horror film, or one of their favourites, and it's certainly up there for me. But Dr. Sleep does everything, and apart from things like maybe Terminator 2 and a few movies of that ilk, that are Godfather Part 2, of course, you could put in that category, of these real sequels that are just special. But I think with Doctor Sleep, it's like the example. If you were showing someone an example of what a sequel should be, I would personally say Doctor Sleep. Because Doctor Sleep, for it as a film, for this first and second act, all the way up until the kind of last 30 to 40 minutes of the film, is not a shining sequel. Well, it is and it isn't. Of course it's Danny Torrance grown up, and of course it is Ewan McGregor, who is in his best role ever. And I love him as Obi-Wan, and I love him in a few other roles, but him as Danny Torrance grown up is the creme de la creme for Ewan McGregor performances. But having Doctor Sleep be, yes, tied in, and yes, there is the early indications, and of course there's a bit of the premise that overlaps, but for the most part, and for certainly 2/3 of the film, the first 2/3 of the film, Doctor Sleep is its own film about shine, about the shining, and the nature of that in the film and on the story, and building on that element. And you have Rebecca Ferguson, who's one of my favourite villains in recent memory, one of the most effective villains in recent memory. She is absolutely fantastic in this. She has now went on to things like, of course she had been in Mission Impossible, and now she's in things like Dune, Part 1 and Part 2, and different things like that. I think she is so wonderful as Rose the Hat. Because her in that performance is it's one of those villains that you can understand their perspective, but also they're also a little bit of just being evil for evil's sake. And then you had everything else. You have everything, and it's so rewarding, because there is a point by that kind of coming into the third act of Doctor Sleep when you go, oh my god, that's the Overlook Hotel. Oh yeah, we are watching a Shining sequel. And then you're in. Then you get a brilliant finale. And I know I've heard a little bit of people saying that they found the biggest critique was the final act. They didn't like how it tied into The Shining, and I'm like, what? The ending is a worthy ending. The film is just so brilliant. And in Mike Flanagan as one of these, he is definitely one of the top 3 horror directors going at the moment, because of what he's done with this. Plus you've got things like The Haunting of Hill House, Midnight Mass. He is really putting such a stamp on modern horror. And for him to get the call, imagine being Mike Flanagan in that scenario and getting the call that you get to do the Shining sequel almost 50 years later, and to not only take that opportunity, but to knock it out of the park with great casting, brilliant performances, brilliant moments and memorable moments, really horrific moments. I would say this movie is scarier than The Shining, because The Shining is more of what I would call iconic scenes. Memorable scenes, brilliant moments throughout the original film of The Shining, ones that people still talk about to this day. So many parodied scenes, so many scenes that people even who don't like horror films know about. Where's Johnny? There's so many scenes, even that sitting at the bar, which of course is emulated in this film, and is one of those real memorable scenes. I've said that a few times now, but just things that always you go back on, and when you think about great horror moments, they're the ones you think of, and The Shining certainly falls into that category. But to do that and have more effective scares, I found there's some real, and not that this film is filled with jump scares or kind of cheap scares, which you've heard me talk about before in some of the worser horror films. Every scare in this film is earned, and some of it's just fear of a situation that a character has been put in. I think Doctor Sleep is just truly one of my favourite sequels ever. I think it is just so fantastic at what they're able to achieve. I think that Ewan McGregor I didn't think he had a performance like this in him, because I'd only really seen him in a few things. Of course, I'm not going to base him on I'm not going to base his whole career on things like The Phantom Menace, because that's not fair. But things like Moulin Rouge, things like Trainspotting, there is he certainly is an actor, but as an actor in those kind of roles, but I didn't think he had a kind of movie like this in his repertoire. I didn't think he had a film like Doctor Sleep and a performance like Danny Torrance all grown up in him. And that's really bumped him up on my list of actors that I love, just for their different performances and their variety performances. And of course, I've already waxed lyrical about Rebecca Fergus's in this. There's so many young performances in the younger children in this, particularly the main girl in this, with Abra, which is played by Kylie Curran, in one of my favourite child performances in recent times. Young actresses who brings... Because she really builds on the theory of The Shining. You know, in the original film, and again, I don't want to talk about too much if you haven't seen either of the films, because I would really want you to go and see them and not just listen to me talk about them. But in the original film, you have Dick Halloran talking to young Danny Torrance and telling him about the shine that he has and The Shining and what it is, and doesn't really go too much further in what it is, what it can do, what powers it has, etc. Whereas through Kylie Curran as Abra in this, it's really developed more, and it's clearly when you can hone your shine, what it can become. And that's such a brilliant element of the film, and it's something, of course, based on the book by Stephen King and having that, but there wasn't liberties taken for the most part, there wasn't liberties taken in this. A lot of it stuck to the source material, but to keep an effective story throughout, and to deviate so far away. Because if you went in just going, oh, I want to see the Overlook Hotel again, I just want to see, Jack Nicholson, I just want to see that again, you're not going to get that. But what you do get is one of the most effective horror films by itself, which in the end ties in to one of the most memorable horror films of all time. And as a fan, and that seems to be the theme of the day, which we were talking about, rewarding experiences for fans of different IPs, Doctor Sleep is one of the more rewarding sequels to a film that didn't need a sequel. Of course, the book was written by Stephen King a lot of years ago, and for anybody who loved the film or loved the original book and then could go and read about the sequel, but to have it adapted so well to the big screen, because while it did kind of a little bit get lost in the shuffle of all the movies that came out this year, because it's probably the strongest year on the sense of how many great films came out and were released. But when I think about it, it was definitely better received than The Shining was. The Shining was a joke in the sense of when it first came out, people kind of hated the film. And then as time went on, it became more than just a cult classic. It became one of the greatest and one of the staples of horror. Whereas Doctor Sleep came out to pretty critical success, but not in the sense of not too many people went and seen it as they should have. I don't know that it was marketed well enough, which is a shame. But for the people that have seen Doctor Sleep, like myself, the people that love The Shining, love the horror genre and what the significance The Shining has had on the horror genre as a whole, and for that to continue through to Doctor Sleep with a modern twist, to have its own film and then tie in at the end, it's one of the most rewarding sequels I've ever seen, and that's why it was so close to being number one for this year. However, it was not, because my number one is number one. Joker is directed by Todd Phillips and stars Joaquin Phoenix and Robert De Niro. So I'm sure you're thinking to yourself, where's he going to put it? Is it in his top 5? Is it number 1? Has it not in his own mentions at least? Where is it? Truth be told, Joker was always going to be here in some form or another. It was either going to be second, it was going to be first. When I wrote this list first, Joker was first. Then I rewatched Doctor Sleep and it went first. Then I rewatched Joker and I thought, no, I was right at the first time. Because while Doctor Sleep is absolutely fantastic, and you've heard me wax lyrical about it there, let's wax lyrical about Joker as a whole, and I mean everything about it. Because to have a film based on a character who has already got one of the most critically acclaimed performances in recent memory in Heath Ledger, not that long before this, the guts of just over 10 years before, so it was fresh in the memory, to take on a role like this and to be up against it to have Joaquin Phoenix, who of course has been around since the Gladiator days and even longer than that, and he has always been given good performances, even something like Signs. I always remember him being memorable in it. But I've got to really admit, I didn't think he was this level of an actor, but my God, was I wrong. His performance as, I'm going to say Arthur Fleck, because in most iterations of the Joker that I've seen, whether that be the comic book side of things, whether that be the video game Arkham Asylum games, you remember that Mark Hamill's portrayal of the cartoon animated versions, or even someone like Heath Ledger or even Jack Nicholson. They're always a certain dialed up version, but they're always the Joker. They aren't the person behind the story of the character. They are not any. There isn't the human side. With Batman, where you have the Batman, the Caped Crusader, etc., and then you've got Bruce Wayne, who are very much, there is a distinction between the two. Joker doesn't really have that until now. Never has the Joker and this character, who is one of definitely a top 3 villain of all time, certainly in memorable nature, certainly in performances, and yes, of course, there's a Jared Leto performance in here, which is whatever it is. Let's not talk about that. But we're talking about real top tier performances as characters, not just as the Joker. Because Joaquin Phoenix, to bring to this, something that really doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to major movies is mental health. And mental health in this is kind of the catalyst for it all. And how people with mental health in this scenario, and I don't want to delve too deep into this deep topic, but it certainly is it feels more of a study on mental health, and the study of how much people can get pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, not even on mental health side of things, just how people get treated if they're different. And not that the Joker is justified in this film, because of course he goes too far off the deep end in the other side and the kind of the final act. But there's a lot of this film where you're sympathising with a sad person who feels like a loner, who is a loner in most and in most scenarios he's trying to just get by in life. But there is so much depth to this. There's so much depth to the Joker as a character, and I don't think that the character has ever got this level of depth before. This level of study into why the Joker is the Joker. And surrounded by other performances like Zazie Beetz, who's became, her as Domino in Deadpool, and some other performances, she brings a lot to this. And then on the other side of things, you have Robert De Niro, you have Robert De Niro, who's Robert De Niro, of course. There's not much else I can really say about Robert De Niro as a performer. But the scene in this that you have probably seen in some form or another is just, and I don't want to say too much because I want you to go and watch it. I need you to. The Joker is just a fantastic film, but there's some scenes, and that scene that I'm talking about with them two in particular is nearly lasered into my mind when it comes to talking about movies in recent years. Joker is just a spectacle of a film. It's one of the best character pieces that I have seen, based on a character that has so many iterations, to have such a fresh outlook on such a different outlook. Because then you get people going, oh, well, I preferred Heath Ledger's Joker to Joaquin Phoenix. But they're just completely different people. Completely different. They're completely different in everything but name. They're both known as the Joker. That's it. The Joker is one of the best. It's just simply one of the best films in recent memory. Again, I could try and narrow it down to best character pieces, best villain stories, blah blah blah. The Joker is just fantastic. It deserved all the praise it got. For Joaquin Phoenix winning the Academy Award was such a worthy winner. I was so glad when that happened, and that's not always the case when it comes to the Academy Awards, because sometimes the brilliant performances get snubbed. And certainly in what you would say is you could kind of call this a superhero film because of the nature of what it's based on, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. it's not really. It's a movie in spite of superheroes, in a way. I just think the Joker it deserved every bit of praise it got. I just love it so much, and that's why it is definitely my favourite film of this year. It really was. There was no debate. You know, when I really think about it, and yes, I talked about Doctor Sleep, and the only reason that got bumped to number one in my mind is because I hadn't seen Joker since it was released in 2019. I hadn't seen it since before, you know, everything was shut, and, you know, I rewatched a lot of movies, and I rewatched Doctor Sleep, and I went, oh my god, that's amazing, I absolutely love it, it has to be number one. But then when you sit and you actually watch the two films, Joker is just, it deserves praise. And before I get into summary and we finish off here talking about the top 5, I do want to say Joker is getting a sequel, Folie à Deux. By the time you see this, we could be even closer to the release, or by the time you're watching it, it could even have been released. And you have Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn. Now, Lady Gaga is fantastic in things like A Star is Born, even in something like American Horror Story. I thought she was great. I don't dispute that she will be a good Harley Quinn. But when I talk about films that do not need a sequel, the Joker is probably top of my list of films that do not need a sequel. Now, that doesn't mean that I might not love Folie à Deux. That means that it doesn't mean that. I'll come into that with open eyes, and I hope and I pray I'm proved wrong that it's a worthy sequel. But at this current point of filming, way before the movie's even been released, the second movie's been released, I have to say, the Joker as a standalone character study on one of the best villains of all time should just be that. No sequel, not needed. Just stick with what we've got. But on that, Joker is so good, and that's why it's definitely my favourite film of the year 2019. So that has been the year 2019, and oh my goodness, what a year. What a year, one of the strongest there's ever been. And again, I've said that a few times, and you're probably sick of me saying how strong these years are and blah blah blah. But look at how many honourable mentions there was. I'm going to read you that list very quickly again. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Rocketman, Jojo Rabbit, Us, It Chapter 2, Spider-Man Far From Home, Uncut Gems, Official Secrets, Parasite, The Irishman, Marriage Story, Zombieland 2, Toy Story 4, Peanut Butter Falcon, Good Boys, Dark Water, Honey Boy, and El Camino. Now, there may be some of those films you went, well, that's not really... I think 2019 is one of the strongest years. See these last 5 of the best. 2017, 2018, 2019. They are my golden era of cinema. Now, I hope to be proved wrong, and I hope from this time onwards that we get something like it. I hope we get the level of quality that we got around this time for movie making and storytelling and all these great different versions, different genres getting done. Things like, you know, look at the differentiation between all these. You know, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, something like Quentin Tarantino, something like Rocketman, which is essentially a musical, something like Us, which is horror, something like Spider-Man Far From Home, which is Marvel. You've all these different... Toy Story 4, which of course is a family film, which again didn't need to be made, but was great when it was. But I've probably thought this whole time, if you've been following 5 of the Best, you're probably thinking, he loves Tarantino. Why is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood not even in the top 5? Why is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood below John Wick Chapter 3? Do you want the simple answer? I like it, but I don't love it. I think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is pretty good. The performances are pretty good. But there's a long part of that movie when I find myself not interested. And I couldn't frame it any other way than that. And that's the main reason. Because if you were doing bets and you were thinking about, if you were basing it on how many times Tarantino has appeared on 5 of the Best, and it's appeared as number 1s and number 2s all the way through, you'd have probably assumed that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood would have been either the first in this list or number 2. I was actually quite disappointed with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I gotta say. I loved some of the performances. I thought Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt in particular were really good. I thought Margot Robbie was fine, and I'm a big fan of her, but I thought that she wasn't used as much as she could have been in the story. But it was just a bit of a letdown. So that's why it wasn't even close to breaking into the top 5 for me. But let's talk about the ones that were close to getting into the top 5. And for that long, long list, there was only 3 that nearly bumped John Wick Chapter 3 off the 5th spot. The first of which is Jojo Rabbit. Jojo Rabbit, directed by Taika Waititi, has one of the... just a brilliant film. I don't even want to say too much more about that. I want you to go and see it yourself, because I don't want to talk about too much about the subject matter. But it's for it to be such a serious matter and such a serious setting that the story is part of, for it to be such a hilarious film, such an emotional film, and such an effective story being told. Jojo Rabbit is brilliant, and I think it's... is it Taika Waititi's best work? It might be. Yeah, could be. The other two, the first of the other two, is Marriage Story. Adam Driver, Scarlett Johansson in probably their 2 best acted roles ever. And of course, Scarlett Johansson is in Jojo Rabbit as well. So she had tell you what, Scarlett Johansson had a really good year. Avengers Endgame, Marriage Story, Jojo Rabbit. She did, yeah. Go on, Scarlett. But yeah, I think Marriage Story was a little bit Oscar bait, but I thought that, so I never really bothered watching the film. But when I actually sat down to watch it, I found it a really emotional and really effectively emotional film about divorce, about children caught up in divorce. I think, and some of the performance, and I think it is the movie that really consolidated for me how damn good Adam Driver is. Because Scarlett Johansson, we already knew by this point. She appeared on 5 of the Best and Lost in Translation way at the start of this series. So she's been here for a long time, and I've always appreciated her performances. I always thought she was great. But Adam Driver, of course, is Kylo Ren and a few other performances. But this is the first one where I went, oh yeah, this guy's the man. He's the next big name in Hollywood on the actor side of things. He's undoubtedly on his way to, I would say, I'd be surprised if he doesn't win at least one Oscar in his time, because this was the film that showed me the most just how good he is. The other one is probably the nichest of this list, which is Peanut Butter Falcon, starring Shia LaBeouf and Dakota Johnson, and it was a film that was actually recommended to me by a friend. I hadn't seen it, hadn't heard too much about it, and I just loved it. I think it is a beautiful film. Again, hard-hitting, but truthfully, I just loved it. I loved it, and I didn't know that I would. I thought some of the performances in here, some of the bond between the characters are just... and some really beautiful moments as well. So that's one, if you're looking for something a little bit nicher, a little bit off the beaten path, a little bit, out there, Peanut Butter Falcon is really damn good. I love that film. But overall, and talking about 2019 as a whole, this was just a brilliant year. And to have these 3 years, as I say, I kind of packaged them together in my own head, which is 2017, 2018, 2019. So many films that I think I'll love for the longest time. And it'll be such a golden era for me, just for the depth of cinema, the depth of genres that were all brilliant and iconic films in each genre being released. There wasn't really any genre that was forgotten about. Everything, whether you're an action movie fan, whether you're a horror movie fan, whether you're a fantasy or a family film or anything, I think it ticks every box around this time. The problem is, and before I end this video, I do just want to say, and this might not be a shock to you, but in the next 5 of the best, we're talking about 2020. Now, you might remember that there was a certain thing happened and there wasn't too many movies released that year. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how are you going to do 2020? I've had a look. There's a list, and I've managed to scrape together 5 movies from 2020. So that'll be next year. But I can tell you this for free, there is not even half as many honourable mentions as there is in this, because 2020 and 2021 it was leading back to the cinemas reopening. So just be mindful of that. But 2019 is probably the last great year of just pure consistency of great films being released, and have such a level of I mean, there's so many films I just loved, adored throughout this time, and it kept me going through 2020, because of course there wasn't much to latch on to in that time. However, we'll get there when we get there. But I want to thank you for taking the time to take out of your day to sit and listen to me talking about movies. If you've enjoyed this video, leave a like, let me know you enjoyed it. If you want to stick around, subscribe for more like this. This is an ongoing series. This will continue through once we get to the present day, and then we'll continue every year that happens. This will be my best of the year type videos ongoing. So if you do want to stick around, I'd appreciate you so much if you do. And if you do, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love everyone.